Are you a caregiver to a loved one that's at the late stage of Alzheimer's? Are you facing the question, when is it important to seek invasive medical treatment for a loved one, and when it's not really helpful to do that? So my mother, as you know from my other videos, my mother was diagnosed with Alzheimer's 11 years ago. And she'd been living with a disease that was gradual progression at times and fast moving at other times. So about 5 weeks ago, one morning, when I got my mother up, got her ready to feed her breakfast, I couldn't keep her alert. Her head was going down like this as I was trying to feed her oatmeal. And I didn't know what was going on. So I checked her sugar level, and that was normal. I gave her a glass of water and checked her temperature, checked her oxygen level. All that was fine. But then finally, I checked her blood pressure, and it was 165/98. And that is a high blood pressure, but it was even alarming for my mother because my mother had no history of high blood pressure. She always had the perfect blood pressure, 120/68. She had other issues caused by Alzheimer's, but high blood pressure was never one of them. So that alarmed me. And then I contacted the nurse because my mother's been admitted to hospice about 3-4 months ago. And with that admission, we have access to a nurse that I could call. She regularly comes twice a month, but if I need to, I could call. Also, there is a hospice triage nurse that I could call if I am concerned about something, to get a hold of the doctor for me. So I called my mother's regularly visiting nurse and I said, this is what I found this morning. Can you please come and check, because I don't know what's going on. So the nurse came that afternoon after I got off work, and then we checked and it was just a high 170/98 again. So the nurse contacted the doctor, and the doctor said there would be an appointment set up for the doctor to come and see my mother. But in the meantime, I was told to check and take notes of my mother's blood pressure level. So right away, I created this spreadsheet where I would take my mother's blood pressure and I would write it down what it was that morning, and then I would have the person who takes care of her during the day take the blood pressure a couple of times and jot it down. I would take when I come back from work and before she goes to bed. So I was checking her blood pressure 4 or 5 times a day and writing. So with that, I noticed that there were certain periods of the day when my mother's blood pressure was quite high. There was a period within that 24 hours where my mother's blood pressure would drop. So I gained that insight. So I am thinking, if I figure out how high or how low my mother's blood pressure goes, what am I going to do with that information? Is that information going to be helpful to me? Would I be able to take that information and use it to decide to take my mother to the hospital, which I don't really want to do because my mother was never fond of hospitals. So if I use this information to help me make a decision whether I would take my mother to the hospital or not, and I decided I want to take her to the hospital, then what do I want to get out of the hospital? What is my goal in doing that? And if I am not going to use that information to take my mother to the hospital, why collect the information? You can see the conundrum here. Should I collect the information and use it to go to the hospital and tell them this is what's going on with my mother? And if I did, what are they going to do for my mother? What would that visit to the hospital help me with? I don't want my mother to have any invasive procedures. And even if you wanted to do EKG, my mother is not going to sit still for EKG to produce the right product. You couldn't do MRI because she would not go through that little tunnel where you go for MRI. She would not do CT scan. There is no way for us to do an x-ray even. We can barely do a blood test. There is no way to even do a urine test. So you could see all these limitations. So if I collect this information, use it to go to the hospital, what do I expect to come out of it? And if I am not going to use this information to take my mother to the hospital, why am I collecting it? Just to sit on the information? This was like reading your teenage child's journals and reading something really hard to take. Now, all of a sudden, you have information you cannot use because you cannot go to the teenager and say, I read this on your journal, because then you're going to start World War III. So what am I going to do with this information? So when the doctor came, I posed that question to the doctor and said, what is my function here? Because you suggested for me to track my mother's fluctuating blood pressure. So what is the point? Why am I collecting this information? Just to sit on it or to take her to the hospital? Because I do not want to take my mother to the hospital because I don't see any benefit of her being there. All I see is drawbacks. My mother getting confused, my mother getting exhausted, maybe even picking up some infections while she's in the hospital. So the doctor looked at me and said, collecting the information doesn't necessarily mean you are going to take your mother to the hospital. Collecting this information has different functions because the goal now is to make sure your mother is not in pain, and whatever it is that's going on, it's not something that's causing her discomfort. And your mother is not in pain. So if we collect the information and that information helps us to know she is in pain, and we can offer her something to comfort her so she is not in pain. So the doctor's suggestion was, and having the information doesn't mean you have this information, you go to the hospital. You have this information, you sit on it. There is a third way, which is we can look at this information and see if based on the information you collected, does this mean that your mother is in pain? Does this mean your mother is uncomfortable in where she is? Does this mean there is infection lingering somewhere which could lead to pain, which we need to give her antibiotics? Does this mean there is pain that she cannot sleep, that she cannot rest, that she cannot express to us? But data you're collecting might give us that information. So she said, my suggestion to you is to always collect the information, have the information, and call hospice triage nurse and tell her what you're noticing, what your concern is, and let us, your mother's medical team, with your consultation for your mother's benefit. And that benefit doesn't necessarily mean she is going to the hospital. And that has made all the difference. So if you are struggling with those questions, it's always a good idea to have good medical care team around you and ask the question. Don't shy away from the question. It's not a question that would bother them. If that question bothered them, then they are not the right medical team for your loved one. Ask the question. The answer might pleasantly surprise you and give you something you haven't thought about, like I did. If you would like to hear my detailed experience of how that concern was addressed by the doctor and how I approached and all the steps and how many days it took me, please listen to my podcast, My Mother, the Person and the Patient. It can be found in wherever you get your podcasts. If you found any benefit in this video, please give me a thumbs up. I would certainly appreciate it. Until next time. Bye for now.